230 feet beneath the frigid waters off the Danish coast, an autonomous underwater vehicle descends through absolute darkness. The sonar has already confirmed what historians refused to believe for 79 years. A German U-boat, missing since May 1945, rests intact on the seafloor. When high-definition cameras finally illuminate her hull, they capture something that will force 3 governments to reopen investigations they declared closed decades ago. Because what the scans reveal inside this submarine is not just the story of how she sank, it is evidence of why she should never have been at sea at all. The Ghost Fleet. When Admiral Karl Dönitz ordered the U-boat fleet to surrender on May 4, 1945, the mathematics of Germany's submarine war became brutally clear. Of the 1,154 U-boats commissioned during the war, approximately 785 had been lost. 28,000 submariners had gone to sea. Fewer than 12,000 came home. The Atlantic had become a graveyard, and the survivors knew it. But not every boat obeyed the surrender order. As the Third Reich collapsed, a handful of U-boat commanders made different calculations. Some scuttled their vessels rather than hand them to the enemy. Others sailed for neutral ports, hoping to avoid prosecution. And a few simply vanished, their fates unknown, their crews never accounted for. U-977 surfaced in Mar del Plata, Argentina, on August 17, 1945, more than 3 months after Germany's surrender. Her commander claimed they had been submerged the entire time, unaware the war had ended. The story was implausible. A Type 7C boat could not remain submerged for that duration. But the Argentine government granted asylum, and the crew disappeared into South America. U-530 surrendered at the same Argentine port weeks later. Her commander offered a similar explanation. Both boats had departed Norway in April 1945, ostensibly on combat patrols. Both arrived in South America long after hostilities ceased. Intelligence officers suspected they had transported high-value passengers or cargo, but no evidence was ever produced. The crews maintained their silence. The boats were scrapped. The questions remained. These cases fueled decades of speculation about U-boats that might have reached South America, Antarctica, or hidden bases in the Atlantic. Most of the theories were nonsense, fantasies built on fragments of truth and amplified by conspiracy. But the core question was legitimate. In the final chaotic weeks of the war, when central authority had collapsed and commanders acted on their own initiative, what orders were given, what missions were attempted, and how many boats simply never made it? Naval archives captured after the war were incomplete. Allied intelligence had broken German naval codes, but not every message was intercepted. Patrol orders for boats departing in April and May 1945 exist only as fragments. Some vessels were recorded as lost, their sinking attributed to Allied action or accidents. Others were listed as missing, their fate unknown. U-320 was one of those boats. Official records show she departed Kristiansand, Norway, on May 2, 1945, under the command of Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Jacobsen. Her mission was listed as a combat patrol in the North Atlantic. She carried a crew of 49 men. She was never heard from again. Allied forces recorded no attacks on U-boats, matching her description in the area she was believed to be operating. No distress signals were received. No debris was found. For 79 years, U-320 existed only as a line in a casualty list, one more name among hundreds. Case closed. Except that in June 2023, a marine research vessel conducting geological surveys off the coast of Denmark detected an anomaly on the seabed. The sonar signature was unmistakable. A submarine, intact, lying at a depth where salvage would be difficult, but investigation was possible. The coordinates placed her roughly 60 nautical miles from where U-320 was last reported. The discovery. The expedition that found her was not looking for U-boats. The Danish Hydrographic Service was mapping subsea infrastructure routes for offshore wind development. The autonomous underwater vehicle they deployed was programmed to identify obstacles that might interfere with cable laying. When the sonar flagged the wreck, The initial assumption was a known casualty, perhaps a merchant vessel sunk earlier in the war. But the dimensions were wrong. The object measured 67 meters long, too small for a freighter, too large for a patrol boat. The shape was distinctive, a pressure hull with streamlined contours, a conning tower amidships, deck gun mounts fore and aft. This was a submarine. The Danish Navy was notified immediately. Historical records were consulted. 4 U-boats were known to have been sunk in Danish waters during the war. All 4 had been located and identified decades earlier. This wreck was not on any list. A remotely operated vehicle descended in July 2023, equipped with high-definition cameras and laser scanning systems. At 70 meters, the floodlights revealed gray paint still visible after 8 decades. The conning tower stood intact, its hatch closed. The deck gun was in position, trained to starboard as though the crew had been tracking a target when they went down. The hull number was partially obscured by marine growth, but photogrammetric analysis reconstructed the faded digits, U320. The discovery was announced quietly. German authorities were informed. Families of the crew, those that could still be located, received notification that the missing boat had been found. But the announcement raised immediate questions. If U320 had been sunk in combat, where was the damage? If she had been scuttled, why was the hull intact? And if she had suffered a mechanical failure or accident, why had she gone down in waters far from her assigned patrol area? The Danish Maritime Authority authorized a full forensic survey. The technology deployed was a generation beyond anything available when the boat had sunk. Multi-beam sonar mapped every contour of the hull. AI-driven photogrammetry created a 3-dimensional model accurate to the millimeter. Side-scan sonar swept the debris field for artifacts. And when the remotely operated vehicle maneuvered close enough to examine the conning tower hatch, the cameras captured something that changed the entire investigation. The hatch was not battened from the inside. It was locked from the outside. If you are still here, you have seen how a U-boat that vanished in May 1945 was found 79 years later with her hatch locked from the outside. Comment the number 2 below if you are following this investigation. And if you have not subscribed, please do so and turn on the bell notification so you do not miss what comes next. Your support helps us tell the stories that official histories tried to close. Now, let us see what the AI scans revealed inside that sealed hull. What the scans revealed. The forensic survey of U320 required 6 weeks of continuous work. Remotely operated vehicles conducted over 200 dives, documenting every accessible compartment through hatches and damaged sections. Ground-penetrating sonar mapped the interior spaces. The 3-dimensional reconstruction assembled from this data would become the most detailed examination of a World War II U-boat ever conducted. What the scans revealed was a ship frozen in time. The forward torpedo room showed all 4 tubes loaded. Spare torpedoes rested in their storage racks. The weapons had been armed and ready to fire, but the boat had never engaged a target. The tubes were loaded and ready. In the control room, valves and switches remained in their final positions. The diving planes were set to descend. The ballast controls showed tanks partially flooded. This was not a boat that had been hit by depth charges or gunfire. This was a boat that had deliberately gone down. But the most disturbing discoveries came from the aft compartments. The crew quarters showed signs of hasty abandonment. Personal effects were scattered across bunks and deck plates. Photographs, letters, uniforms still hung on hooks. The galley had food prepared but not eaten. Coffee cups sat on tables, their contents long dissolved into the surrounding water. It appeared the crew had been in the middle of a normal day when something happened. The engineering spaces told a different story. The diesel engines were cold, their fuel lines closed. The electric motors showed no signs of damage or malfunction. The battery compartments were intact. There was no mechanical failure that would have forced an emergency dive. The boat had been fully operational when she went down. Then the cameras found the bodies. 49 men, the entire crew, remained aboard. Most were in the aft torpedo room and the engine compartment, areas that would have flooded last as the boat descended. The positions of the remains suggested the men had been conscious when the water came in. They had tried to reach the escape hatches. They had failed. Naval forensic experts analyzing the footage noted something that made the scene even more horrific. The escape trunk in the conning tower, the standard emergency exit for U-boat crews, showed no signs of use. The hatch at the top was secured from the outside. The mechanism that should have allowed the crew to open it from within had been disabled. The hatch was secured. Someone had locked them in, and then sent the boat to the bottom. The cargo hold revealed what may have prompted such a drastic measure. Standard procedure for U-boats returning from patrol was to offload torpedoes and ammunition before entering port. U-320 carried a full weapons load, but she also carried something else. Stacked in the hold were wooden crates marked with SS insignia. The crates had partially deteriorated, but their contents were still identifiable. Documents, files, record books, the kind of material that organizations destroy when they fear capture. Among the crates were smaller containers made of lead. Radiation surveys conducted by the remotely operated vehicle detected elevated levels consistent with uranium compounds. Not weapons-grade material, but concentrated enough to suggest these were samples or experimental materials. The presence of such cargo on a combat submarine in May 1945 was extraordinary. U-boats had been used throughout the war to transport strategic materials, technical experts, and high-value cargo between Germany and Japan. But those missions were carefully planned and documented. U-320 had been listed as a combat patrol, not a cargo run. Her departure had been rushed, her orders vague. Whatever she was carrying had been loaded in secret. The final piece of evidence came from the conning tower itself. Welded to the exterior hull, just below the hatch, was a steel plate engraved with a single sentence in German: Für das Vaterland und die Zukunft. For the fatherland and the future. This was not a war grave. This was a tomb, and the men inside had been sacrificed to keep its contents hidden. The final voyage. Reconstructing the final hours of U-320 required cross-referencing fragmentary evidence from multiple sources. German naval records captured after the war included patrol orders, wireless traffic logs, and personnel files. Allied intelligence had intercepted some communications. Norwegian resistance fighters had observed U-boat movements from coastal stations. And the wreck itself provided forensic evidence that filled in the gaps. U-320 departed Kristiansand on May 2, 1945. Germany would surrender unconditionally 6 days later, but that outcome was already inevitable. The Wehrmacht was collapsing on all fronts. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. The men boarding U-320 knew they were sailing into a lost war. The crew manifest showed 49 submariners, most of them veterans with multiple patrols. Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Jakobsen had commanded the boat since her commissioning in 1943. His record showed competence but not brilliance. He was the kind of officer who followed orders and kept his crew alive. Exactly the kind of man you would choose for a mission that required discretion. Wireless intercepts show that U-320 transmitted a single message 12 hours after departure. The transmission was brief and encrypted. Allied codebreakers never decrypted it. The message was addressed to Flensburg, the temporary seat of the German government after Berlin fell. No reply was recorded. Norwegian coastal observers reported a surfaced U-boat, matching U-320's description on the night of May 3rd, traveling northwest at high speed. The boat was running with minimal lighting, unusual for a vessel supposedly on a combat patrol. Standard procedure was to remain submerged during daylight and surface only at night to recharge batteries and refresh air. U-320 was moving as though trying to reach a destination quickly. The wreck's position, 60 nautical miles off the Danish coast, places her well outside her stated patrol area. She should have been heading west into the Atlantic. Instead, she had turned south, toward waters where Allied naval forces were concentrated. This was not the behavior of a boat hunting targets. This was the behavior of a boat trying to reach a specific location. The forensic analysis of the hull provides the timeline for what happened next. Sonar imaging shows that U-320's ballast tanks were deliberately flooded. The diving planes were set to maximum descent angle. The boat had been sent to the bottom under power, not as a result of damage or failure. Someone had given the order to scuttle. But the evidence inside the hull contradicts the scenario of a standard scuttling operation. When U-boat crews scuttled their vessels, procedure was to open hatches, destroy sensitive equipment, and abandon ship. The crew would take to life rafts or swim to shore if land was close. U-320's crew did not abandon ship. They were still aboard when she went down. The locked conning tower hatch explains why. In a normal scuttling, the hatch would be left open to allow the crew to escape. Here, it had been secured from the outside. The men in the control room would have realized what was happening when the water began rising. They would have tried to reach the escape trunk. They would have found it sealed. Survivor testimony exists from another U-boat that had been in the same Norwegian port as U-320. A radio man who had been transferred to a different boat days before U-320 departed later reported that the crew had been confined to the vessel for 48 hours before sailing. Shore leave was canceled. No communication with families was permitted. Armed SS personnel had been observed boarding the boat to supervise cargo loading. The radio man's account, documented in Allied debriefing records, suggested that the crew had been under guard. Whether they knew what they were carrying or why their mission was so sensitive remains unknown. What is clear is that someone at a higher level of command had decided that U-320 and her crew could not be allowed to fall into Allied hands. The final piece of the timeline comes from the wreck's debris field. Scattered around the submarine are fragments of wooden crates and metal containers. Some had been thrown clear when the boat struck the bottom. Others had been ejected through ruptured sections of the hull. Among the debris, the remotely operated vehicle found something that should not have been there. A Kriegsmarine officer's sidearm, lying on the seabed 20 meters from the wreck. The pistol had been fired. One round was missing from the magazine. Naval forensic experts theorized that an officer aboard U-320 may have tried to stop the scuttling. A struggle may have occurred in the control room. The shot may have killed the officer attempting to surface the boat, or the officer carrying out the scuttling order. There is no way to know. What is certain is that the boat went down with her crew trapped inside, and someone on the surface had ensured they could not escape. The orders that killed them. To understand why U-320 was sent to the bottom with her crew still aboard, you have to understand the command structure that existed in the final weeks of the Third Reich. By May 1945, centralized authority had collapsed. Admiral Dönitz, now serving as Germany's head of state after Hitler's suicide, was focused on negotiating surrender terms with the Allies. He had already ordered the U-boat fleet to cease hostilities and return to port. But Dönitz did not control every element of the German war machine. The SS maintained its own command structure, its own priorities, and its own plans for the post-war period. In the chaos of Germany's collapse, SS officers were destroying records, evacuating assets, and eliminating evidence of war crimes. U-boats provided one means of moving people and materials out of Europe. Declassified intelligence documents show that Allied forces were aware of this activity. British and American naval intelligence tracked suspected SS evacuation missions throughout April and May 1945. Some boats were intercepted, others reached South America. A few were never accounted for. U-320 appears to have been part of this shadow operation. The cargo she carried, documents and materials marked with SS insignia, suggests she was transporting records that the organization wanted hidden. The uranium compounds found in her hold indicate that research materials, possibly related to Germany's nuclear program, were also aboard. But U-320 never reached her destination. Whether her crew was aware of the true nature of their mission remains unclear. What is clear is that someone in the SS command structure decided that the boat could not be allowed to surrender. The risk of the cargo falling into Allied hands was deemed unacceptable. The order to scuttle would have come from Flensburg, where remnants of the German government were operating under Dönitz's nominal leadership. But the order to seal the crew inside would have come from someone with SS authority. This was not a military decision. This was an act of murder disguised as operational necessity. Similar incidents occurred throughout the final weeks of the war. Concentration camp records show that SS personnel executed prisoners who might have served as witnesses to atrocities. Intelligence agents eliminated collaborators who knew too much. U-320's crew became victims of the same ruthless calculus. They had seen the cargo. They had participated in a mission that was never officially documented. They could not be allowed to talk. The man who likely gave the final order was never identified. Flensburg's records from early May 1945 are incomplete. Many documents were destroyed before Allied forces arrived. The SS officers, who might have known the truth, either died in the war's final days or disappeared into the chaos of occupied Germany. But the pattern is consistent with other SS operations in the same period. Secrecy was paramount. Witnesses were eliminated. Evidence was destroyed. And when destruction was not possible, evidence was hidden where it would never be found. The locked hatch on U-320's conning tower was not an accident. It was a deliberate act. Someone stood on that deck, secured the mechanism, and condemned 49 men to death. And then, that same person ensured the boat would sink far from shore, in waters deep enough that discovery seemed unlikely. For 79 years, the strategy worked. U-320 remained lost, her cargo hidden, her crew's fate unknown. The official record listed her as missing, presumed lost in combat. No investigation was conducted. No questions were asked. Case closed. Until the sonar found her, and the cameras revealed what had been done. The reckoning. The discovery of U-320 forced German authorities into an uncomfortable position. The wreck is a war grave, protected under international law, but it is also a crime scene. 49 men were murdered, and evidence of that murder lies on the seabed off Denmark. German naval historians who reviewed the forensic documentation confirmed what the scans suggested. This was not a combat loss. This was not an accident. This was an execution. The crew had been sealed inside their boat and sent to the bottom as part of a cover-up that prioritized secrecy over human life. Descendants of the crew had spent decades believing their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had died fighting. The truth is more disturbing. They died because they were inconvenient. They died because someone in a position of authority decided their lives mattered less than protecting whatever was in those crates. The uranium compounds found aboard raise questions that may never be answered. Germany's nuclear weapons program was nowhere near producing a functioning bomb by May 1945. But research had been conducted. Materials had been refined. And as the Allied armies closed in, decisions were made about what to preserve and what to destroy. If U-320 was carrying research materials or samples from that program, the SS may have intended to move them beyond Allied reach. Similar efforts were documented. U-234, the boat that surrendered to American forces carrying uranium oxide, proved that such missions were real. The difference is that U-234's commander chose to surrender. U-320's crew was not given that choice. The documents found in the cargo hold, those marked with SS insignia, will never be recovered. The seawater has reduced them to fragments. But their presence confirms that U-320 was carrying institutional records that the SS wanted hidden. Personnel files, operational logs, evidence of activities that would become war crimes once the Nuremberg trials began. Sealing that evidence on the seafloor was the final act of an organization that had spent 12 years perfecting the machinery of secrecy and murder. The SS had killed millions in camps and ghettos. 49 more deaths aboard a doomed submarine, barely registered. It was simply operational efficiency applied to a logistical problem. No one was ever prosecuted for what happened to U-320. The officers who gave the orders are long dead. The SS command structure that authorized the mission was dismantled in 1945. Justice, in any conventional sense, is impossible. But the wreck itself serves as evidence. The locked hatch, the sealed compartments, the cargo hold filled with materials that someone wanted hidden. These are not ambiguous. They tell a story of institutional cruelty that extended even to the regime's own personnel. The families of the crew now know that their ancestors did not die in combat. They died because they were betrayed by the system they served. Whether that knowledge brings closure or simply adds another layer of grief is not for outsiders to judge. What is clear is that the official narrative, the one that listed U-320 as missing in action and moved on, was incomplete. The truth was lying on the seabed, waiting for technology advanced enough to find it. Closing. U-320 remains on the bottom of the North Sea at a 70 meters depth. Danish and German authorities have designated the site a protected war grave under international maritime law. No salvage operations are permitted. No artifacts will be recovered. The bodies of 49 men will stay where they were sent on a May morning in 1945 when someone sealed them inside their submarine and flooded the tanks. The uranium compounds found in the cargo hold remain exactly where they were placed 79 years ago. The documents marked with SS insignia, reduced now to fragments dissolved by decades of salt water, will never be read. Whatever secrets they contained died with the crew who transported them. The locked hatch that condemned those men still bears the marks of the mechanism that sealed it from the outside. But the three-dimensional scans, the forensic documentation, the photographic evidence captured by remotely operated vehicles, these are now part of the permanent record. The AI-driven reconstruction allows researchers to examine every detail of the wreck without disturbing the grave itself. Future historians will have access to data that previous generations could only speculate about. The wreck has testified in ways that no survivor ever could. For the families of the crew, descendants now 3 and 4 generations removed from the men who died, the discovery brought a truth more bitter than the uncertainty they had lived with. 79 years of believing their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had perished fighting. 79 years of honoring sacrifices made in combat. All of it based on a lie. The men of U-320 did not die in battle. They died because someone in the SS command structure decided that secrecy mattered more than their lives. The institutional pattern is impossible to ignore. The Third Reich murdered millions in concentration camps and execution pits. It destroyed entire communities in pursuit of ideological purity. And in its final days, as Allied armies closed in and defeat became certain, it turned that same ruthless machinery on its own personnel. Witnesses were eliminated. Evidence was destroyed. And when destruction was not sufficient, evidence was buried in places where it was never supposed to be found. U-320 was meant to be one of those places. Deep enough that salvage seemed improbable. Remote enough that discovery was unlikely. The calculation was sound by 1945 standards. No one could have anticipated autonomous underwater vehicles, AI-powered sonar mapping, or remotely operated submersibles capable of documenting a wreck site in millimeter-accurate detail. The technology that would expose the crime did not exist when the crime was committed. But it exists now, and what it revealed cannot be explained away as misfortune or tactical necessity. The locked hatch alone tells the story. You do not seal your own crew inside a submarine unless you intend them to die. You do not flood ballast tanks with men still aboard unless their deaths serve a purpose more important than their lives. The cargo may have justified the mission in the minds of whoever authorized it, but no cargo justifies murder. 49 submariners went to sea in May 1945. They were experienced sailors, men who had survived the deadliest service in the German military. The U-boat war had already claimed 28,000 of their comrades. They knew the risks of combat. They accepted those risks. What they did not know was that the greatest threat they faced came not from Allied destroyers or aircraft, but from the system they served. The Allied navies sank 785 U-boats during the war. Depth charges, torpedoes, bombs, gunfire. Those were the weapons that sent German submarines to the bottom. But U-320 was not sunk by the enemy. She was sunk by her own side, and the men aboard had no chance to fight back. No opportunity to surrender, no hope of survival. For 79 years, the official story stood unchallenged, missing in action, presumed lost in combat. Case closed. The wreck tells a different truth. And that truth, preserved in steel and silence on the seafloor, is all that remains of 49 men who were betrayed by the very forces they had sworn to serve.